A lot of people have been swayed to the Kenny Christensen is DB Cooper camp. Hi, this is Anthony and welcome back to my show. On the surface of it, a few things look very suspicious with Christensen and seem like they point in the right direction. But do they? Kenny was never a suspect by authorities, so how did he become one of the most fought over Cooper candidates in the Cooper sphere? I argue that there's not only no fire, there's not even any smoke in this case. Reason 1, Kenny is not a good candidate at all. Who first proposed the idea that Kenny was D.B. Cooper? Actually, it was his brother Lyle Christensen. Lyle stated that on his deathbed, Kenny told Lyle that he had a secret that he wished that he could tell his brother. Supposedly at the time, Lyle had no idea what it was. Only years later, when Lyle was sitting watching a documentary on television about D.B. Cooper, he concluded that of all the possible things in the world that his brother could have done and wanted to tell him, but for some reason couldn't, that being an infamous skyjacker must be the explanation. So what's the logical explanation? This is not my original idea. I heard it or read it years ago somewhere on the internet. But I wholeheartedly agree. This is the secret. This is not one of those things where I think it's a good chance that this is the reason. This is one of those situations where I have no doubt this is the reason. I think that the secret that Kenny wanted to tell his brother, but couldn't bring himself to do so, was to admit to his brother that Kenny, a single flight attendant who lived in a little house alone, was gay. As we all know these days, homosexuality is becoming more and more socially acceptable, but there are still problems, and we see that in the news almost every day. But you have to remember that Kenny, coming of age in the 1940s and 50s, on into the 1990s when he died, most gays lived in the closet and feared for their jobs, as well as discrimination in all aspects of life, including from their own relatives. I think that's the simplest and most logical argument, especially in Kenny Christensen's case. Oh, and by the way, after Lyle made this identification that his brother was the skyjacker, he tried to convince the FBI, who wasn't buying it, and then he tried to sell his story to a movie director to get a movie made about his brother, which no one was interested in doing. So very clearly, Lyle had a financial motive to push this narrative and nothing to lose if he was unsuccessful. And here we are fighting about it on the internet many years later. Reason 2, let's look at the means now. Did Kenny have the means to pull off the skyjacking? I think that he did. It is certainly believed that he had at least some limited paratrooping experience from the end of World War II and during the occupation of Japan. Clearly, not all paratroopers become skyjackers, and it seemed that Cooper might have had some but limited jump experience, and so here Kenny might be a match. Kenny, working for Northwest Orient Airlines, originally as a mechanic and then a steward and then a purser, would give him knowledge of the airplane and procedures of the company. But this is perhaps the biggest reason why he is not Cooper in my mind. If Kenny was going to rob an airliner, I do not see him robbing his own company in such a public fashion. Cooper bought a ticket in Portland at the ticket office of Northwest Orient, took Flight 305 up to Seattle, where he came into contact with the stewardesses. Eventually they landed in Seattle, got the parachutes and money, took off again, and at some point he exited the plane. And then you know what? Kenny Christensen continued working for Northwest Orient Airlines until he retired, and his home base was from the airport in Seattle. One would think that a fairly recognizable guy would have some fear flying with his own airline, worried that somebody at some point would recognize him, or else recognize him coming and going in Seattle at the airport for perhaps years and years after the skyjacking. Now, some people have pointed out that perhaps he mainly flew international routes and so was less likely to come in contact with many domestic flight crews. That might be true to a degree, but again, those domestic flights and those international flights are all going through Seattle. The odds that the flight crew, including the stewardesses from the hijacked plane, would eventually run into Kenny at the airport in subsequent days, months, or years, and then recognize him would be high if he was the skyjacker. So another reason why he wasn't the skyjacker in my mind. Reason 3, Kenny did not end up with the ransom money. We know that at least $5,800 of the ransom money was found 9 years later, buried in the sand at a place called Tina Bar, which is downstream from Vancouver, Washington. The likely explanation for some money getting there was that Cooper lost some or all of the money either in the Washougal River watershed, which flowed south into the Columbia River, or directly into the Columbia River, which flows westward towards the Pacific Ocean. Likely the money, perhaps still all in the bag given to Cooper, sank to the bottom of the Columbia and then was dredged up and deposited at Tina Bar in 1974. The Columbia has a lot of large ships that travel along it, and so periodically it needs to be dredged so that they don't scrape the bottom. Is it possible that the skyjacker lost only about $6,000 and made it away with the other $194,000? Highly unlikely, but let's say that he did. Did Kenny all of a sudden end up with approximately $200,000 the day after the hijacking in 1971? Some people would like you to think that. In 1972, he bought a small house. Some people say that he paid cash. The mortgage documents say otherwise, and it took him 19 years to pay off the mortgage. And again, none of Cooper's money was ever found in circulation, and only $5,800 was found in the sand in 1980 has ever been tied to the skyjacking. Reason 4. What was Kenny's motive? It's pointed out that his airline, like many airlines, had financial problems and labor troubles. Over the years, I believe there were 8 strikes while Kenny was employed by Northwest Orient. So was Kenny so desperate for money that he, unlike anybody else who worked for the airline, decided that he was going to hijack a plane from his own company? Again, when you think about this, it's pretty ridiculous. Lots of people go on strike. They don't commit major crimes to make up for the lost money. Plus, unionized workers pay into a strike fund. So, when they go on strike, they get paid for showing up and carrying pickets. Even when his company was on strike, he likely was getting some money from the union as strike pay. Also, one of the stewardesses asked Cooper about his reasons for hijacking the plane. He stated that he had a grudge, but not a grudge against her company. So, assuming that he was telling the truth, then it wasn't Kenny, because Kenny would maybe have had a grudge against the airline, at least in the narrative that some people want to promote. But again, this is an airline that Kenny seemed to have worked for decades, and well after the hijacking. So he's probably happier working for Northwest Orient than his detractors want you to think. I think most of us are familiar with Brad Meltzer's episode on Kenny Christensen. It makes Kenny sound so destitute that at some points he had to resort to digging trenches to make money. However, they even read the letter that Kenny sent to his family that this is based on, and it's not necessarily what it sounds like. It says that he's living on burning Keesman's land and helping them dig a septic tank. Now, let's think about this. You're renting a room from somebody that lives in a rural area. They have some septic tank issues and they need to dig it up. You're there on your days off when you're not scheduled to be flying on the airline. Of course, you're going to help them dig up the line, since the toilet that you use yourself probably is supposed to flow into that septic tank. Definitely not a case where he's having to go after manual labor to meet ends meet, but rather helping out his landlord at the location where he's living. You can find that in the show at approximately 32 minutes and 15 seconds. Reason 5. Kenny looks nothing like D.B. Cooper. Now, there's a number of other suspects who look far closer to Cooper than Kenny does. By all accounts, Kenny around that time was already bald on the top of his head. Some people claim that prior to the hijacking, he always wore a toupee, and then right after the hijacking, he stopped. I've not seen a single shred of evidence indicating that any of that is true. If you look at the police sketch of Cooper, his hair is thinning, but he has some on the top of his head, and that does not look like a toupee. If people wear a toupee, it's usually something that covers up the head quite well. And it doesn't make any sense that somebody's going to wear a toupee up until Thanksgiving 1971, and then all of a sudden after that, they're showing up to work the next day or a few days later, and they're no longer wearing the toupee. Aren't people going to ask questions, or at least notice? But again, no one's going to ask questions about him being Cooper because nobody thought he was Cooper at the time. because there was nothing that tied him to being Cooper. He's also said to have been shorter and thinner than Cooper. And lastly, on the appearance, usually when we see the sketch artist renderings of Cooper based on the stewardess's information, we see them in black and white, and in black and white he looks like a middle-aged white man. However, if you look at the color versions, he is actually not depicted as being a light-skinned white man, and in fact, if you actually read up on the case, including the FBI file, the stewardess said that she believed that Cooper had Indian or Mexican blood. And again, those were the terms used 50 years ago. Just to be clear, the term Indian meant Native American, not from the country of India. Does Scandinavian Kenny Christensen look like he's part Mexican or Native American? Not in my mind. So those are my top 5 reasons why Kenny Christensen is not the skyjacker known as D.B. Cooper. As I've said, I personally don't think that Cooper survived the jump for various reasons, although I'm certainly open to the possibility that he did survive the jump. Whether he died or if he did survive, I believe that the odds are he is currently an unknown person who has not been proposed as the suspect. Even if I'm wrong about that, I think that there are a number of other more credible suspects that everyone in the Cooper sphere know about. A few other things. In Brad Meltzer's documentary, the investigators supposedly find an empty small hidden area in the attic of his old home. Was this really a hiding place for the Cooper money or for other valuables? It certainly could have been a hiding place, but they didn't show the rest of the attic, and all this was covered up by fluffy insulation. If you've never been into the attic of an old house like that, you may not realize that there are not necessarily floorboards over the beams, and if you step in the wrong spot, you can end up with your foot through the ceiling of the room underneath you. So it does make sense to put flooring up there. Since we did not see the rest of the attic, since it was covered up by the insulation, we do not know what the rest looked like, and this could well not have been so suspicious. Again, he could have hidden something up there, but it does not prove that he put the D.B. Cooper ransom there. There is reference made to teenagers finding a bag of $20 bills somewhere behind the property after a new owner of the property cleared the land. I've actually found on the internet where one of the kids, who's now an adult, said that they found money up there. I think it was around $2,000. Turned it into the police, and eventually they were given the cash equivalent when nobody came forward to claim the money. He provided a photograph of what he claims was the money sitting on a table before they turned it into the police. They were, for the most part, if not all, $20 bills, but they were from subsequent years. None of them were from the years or matched the serial numbers from the Cooper money. If this money did in fact exist, and this isn't a hoax, there's nothing that ties it to the Cooper ransom. It is possible that a single man living in a little house in the woods who travels a lot for his airline job might not trust banks entirely and hide some cash on his property for a rainy day. It's not inconceivable, but it doesn't prove that he's a skyjacker. I don't have any interest in proving whether this story about the money being found is true or not, but one would think that if in fact it had been turned into the police, say back in the 1990s or whenever it was found, that there would be some record in this little community that the police had received the money and then at some point had returned an equal amount of money to the teenage boys who had found it. Maybe somebody will investigate that lead, but even if it's proven to be true, we know that it was never claimed that the cash was from the ransom, and so therefore it doesn't prove anything other than perhaps Kenny had some money hidden in his forested backyard. I will have a link to the Brad Meltzer episode in the show notes. I think that you should make your own conclusions based on as much evidence on this case as possible. Even if you respect me and my line of thinking, don't just conclude Anthony says that Kenny is not Cooper, so that's what I'll go with. Make your own decisions, but at least use my points of rebuttal when you're making your own determinations on each of the facts. And I would love to hear from you if you've made it through that documentary. I find some of it so cringy it's hard to watch. I don't want to call out anybody in particular, but when you watch the thinking and what is said by the investigators, it does not inspire much confidence in their analytical skills. For instance, towards the end of the show, they interview a person who knew Kenny Christensen and is thought by a co-author who wrote a book arguing that this guy, Bernie Giesman, was Christensen's accomplice in the Cooper caper. They conclude that Bernie was not an accomplice, but that segment is so cringy. And you think about how 60 Minutes would have handled it, probably in a more professional manner and without all the B-roll of dramatically walking up and knocking on the door of the cheap hotel room where the interview took place. And lastly, at the end of the documentary, Brad Meltzer clearly states that he thinks Kenny Christensen is the best candidate for Cooper. One wonders if Brad has looked at any other candidates. Wikipedia has a list of them. There are innumerable websites that cover the case. I don't know how any serious person, if they did a few hours of research, could come away with thinking that Kenny Christensen is the best candidate. Okay, that's all I want to say for today. I have lots of other videos dealing with this case, from specific individuals to a number of videos dealing with issues concerning the titanium particles found on the tie that Cooper left behind. I also do other videos on other mysteries as well as stock investing and side hustles. If you haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you click the subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything, and you literally just have to click that button. And if you like this video, even if you disagree with me, I would appreciate it if you'd click the like button, and please do leave a comment. I read all the comments eventually, and I try to reply to each one when I have the opportunity. Many of your comments have changed my mind on certain aspects of the case. I'm truly open-minded on this case, and I hope that you'll be too. Thanks again for watching.